It wasn't about avenging a forgotten slight or a sudden burst of rage. It was a cold, calculated roll of the dice that would wake a giant. November 26, 1941. A striking force of the Imperial Japanese Navy, 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, and roughly 430 warplanes, slipped out of Japanese waters and began a silent voyage toward a meeting point 230 miles north of Oahu. Their destination? The U.S. Pacific Fleet, sleeping soundly at Pearl Harbor. The date circled on their calendars, December 7th. If everything went as planned, the Americans would never see it coming. The assault would cripple the Navy for months and claim over 2,000 American lives. But here's the twist the Japanese didn't see coming. That very attack would seal their own destruction in World War II. So what actually drove Tokyo to punch a sleeping giant? And where did their brilliant plan go fatally wrong? To understand that, don't we first need to rewind to a time when Japan was dreaming of empires? Throughout the early 1900s, Japan had been racing to catch up with the West. They modernized their economy, bulked up their military, and watched how Britain and the United States had built vast empires. Japan wanted the same: colonies to supply raw materials, cheap labor to exploit, and trade routes to dominate. They wanted a seat at the table of world powers. But there was one brutal truth Japan couldn't escape. Their home islands were a resource desert. No oil fields to speak of. Limited coal. Almost no iron ore. Everything they needed to fuel their imperial dream, especially oil, had to come from somewhere else. So where do you turn when your own land gives you nothing? The first big gamble came in 1931. Japan seized Manchuria, a Chinese province dripping with coal and iron. It was a foothold, a launching pad. Over the next few years, they kept pushing deeper into northern China, testing boundaries. Then, in July 1937, the simmering conflict exploded into full-scale war. At first, the Japanese war machine was unstoppable. Victory after victory. But alongside their military success came horrors that turned global opinion against them. The rape of Nanjing, the terror bombing of civilian populations. By 1939, though, the tide had shifted. China wasn't falling anymore. It was a grinding stalemate, and every day Japan burned through more men and supplies than they could replace. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Washington was watching with growing unease. After the bloodbath of World War I, America had wrapped itself in a blanket of isolationism. No alliances. No foreign wars. Not even military aid to allies. Congress had actually made this official in the mid-1930s with a series of neutrality acts. But the world was getting more dangerous by the month. Hitler was on the march in Europe. Japanese bombs were falling on Chinese cities. Public opinion in America began to slowly shift. By 1939, President Roosevelt signed a new Neutrality Act, one that allowed Britain and France to buy American weapons if they picked them up themselves. Then came Lend-Lease in 1941, giving supplies to China and the Soviet Union with no strings attached. America was officially neutral, but everyone could see which way they were leaning. For Japan, that was terrifying. Why would Tokyo care about American sympathy for China? Here's why: oil. In 1939, Japan imported 94% of its oil. And 80% of that came straight from the United States. No oil means no tanks, no planes, no warships. The campaign in China would grind to a halt. Their entire imperial ambition would evaporate. The same went for scrap metal, coal, iron, all the bones of a war machine, and most of that also came from America. So Japan faced a fork in the road. Two paths. The Imperial Army wanted the northern strategy, push into Siberia, Mongolia, and northern China, regions rich in coal, iron, and oil. The Imperial Navy pushed for the southern strategy, strike down into British Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, where oil and rubber flowed like gold. By the mid-1930s, the northern strategy was already underway. But then came the Battle of Khalkhin Gol in 1939. A brutal clash where Soviet and Mongolian forces demolished the Japanese army. That defeat, combined with the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact in August 1939, poured cold water on any plans to invade Siberia. When the North slams the door in your face, what's left? The Southern Strategy. In 1940, Japan moved into northern French Indochina to cut off China's supply routes. The United States saw this as another act of aggression threatening American interests in the Pacific. Add to that Japan's new alliance with Nazi Germany and Italy, and Washington had seen enough. The US slapped an embargo on iron, steel, and copper, all critical to Japan's war industries. But Japan didn't back down. In July 1941, they occupied the rest of French Indochina, turning it into a launch pad for invasions further south. This time, America responded with something far more devastating. The US froze all Japanese assets in American banks. That meant Japan could no longer buy oil. Then Britain and the Netherlands, who controlled the Dutch East Indies, added their own oil embargoes. In one sweeping move, Japan lost 94% of its entire oil supply. Think about that. Almost all of your fuel, gone overnight. Japan was now in full-blown crisis mode. They tried negotiating. The American demands? Withdraw completely from China. Abandon the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy. For Japan, that was surrender without a fight. They would rather die than accept humiliation. So they made a choice. Seize the resources by force. Strike south into British Malaya and the Dutch East Indies. But they absolutely knew, that America would retaliate. And so the plan evolved. Before the US could respond, Japan would cripple the American Pacific Fleet where it slept. At Pearl Harbor, the logic seemed sound. Smash the battleships. By 6 months, maybe a year, of free reign in the Pacific. Dig in defensively. Build an impenetrable empire. Then force America to negotiate a peace from a position of weakness. Japan didn't think they could win a long war against the United States. So they bet everything on a short one. They assumed Americans didn't have the stomach for a costly war thousands of miles from home. December 7, 1941. 7:55 a.m. Hawaiian time. The first wave, 183 aircraft, appeared in the skies above Pearl Harbor. The Americans had no warning. The wave split into 3 groups. Dive bombers and fighters screamed toward the airfields, catching American planes parked wingtip to wingtip, perfectly lined up for slaughter. The other group targeted Battleship Row. American commanders had thought the harbor was too shallow for torpedoes. They were wrong. Japan had engineered a new torpedo specifically for these shallow waters. It worked beyond their wildest expectations. Within 5 minutes, 4 battleships were hit. The USS Oklahoma rolled over. Then came the USS Arizona. A single armor-piercing bomb pierced its forward magazine. The explosion lifted the 30,000-ton ship out of the water. It sank in 9 minutes. 1,177 crewmen died, nearly half of all American casualties that day. At 8:54 a.m., the second wave, 170 more aircraft, continued the slaughter. But now the base was on high alert. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. The Japanese still inflicted terrible damage, but they paid a steeper price. When it was over, just 90 minutes from first bomb to last, the Japanese had sunk or damaged 18 American warships. Every single battleship in the Pacific Fleet was hit. 188 aircraft destroyed. The airfield and harbor infrastructure were wrecked. But here's the detail that would unravel everything. The 3 American aircraft carriers were out at sea that day. They survived untouched. Desperation and miscalculation, that's the fuel of history's greatest disasters. On that same day, Japan launched coordinated attacks across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Thailand surrendered within hours and signed an alliance with Japan. Guam, Wake Island, the Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong, all fell in rapid succession. 2 British capital ships, HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, were sunk off Malaya's coast. Through early 1942, Japan seized the Dutch East Indies, Burma, Singapore, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. The US Pacific Fleet couldn't stop them. Japan had achieved its goal with terrifying speed. They had their empire. They had their oil. So if everything worked perfectly, why did it all fall apart? Because they completely misunderstood their enemy. Japan wanted a negotiated peace. Instead, they got a furious giant. December 8, 1941. President Roosevelt stood before Congress and delivered his famous Day of Infamy speech. The vote for war was nearly unanimous. America was officially in. They woke the sleeping giant only to discover he was never really asleep. The isolationist movement evaporated overnight. Hundreds of thousands of young men volunteered for military service. American factories, already the largest industrial machine on Earth, shifted to total war production. The sleeping giant wasn't just awake. It was armed, angry, and building ships faster than Japan could sink them. Japan's hope for a short war died in those first months. They had committed to a long struggle against an enemy with 10 times their industrial capacity. The very attack meant to buy time had guaranteed that time was not on their side. What happens when a brilliant tactical victory leads directly to strategic annihilation? The answer is written across the Pacific. Guadalcanal, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each battle bloodier than the last. By 1945, Japanese cities lay in ashes. The fleet that launched the Pearl Harbor attack was at the bottom of the ocean. And 2 atomic bombs finally forced an empire that refused to surrender to its knees. So here's what Pearl Harbor really teaches us. Japan's attack wasn't madness. It was a calculated gamble based on a fatal miscalculation. They believed America was weak, divided, and unwilling to sacrifice. They were catastrophically wrong. And isn't that the most dangerous mistake any leader can make, projecting your own fears onto an opponent who doesn't share them? If you made it this far, do me a favor, smash that like button for War Real History. Because understanding why history's worst decisions got made is the first step to never repeating them.